There is a kind of silence that a room produces when something happens that nobody expected. Not the silence of boredom, not the silence of awkwardness, the silence of a room collectively holding its breath, because something real just occurred, and everyone present instinctively understands that they are watching a moment that belongs to someone else entirely. That silence fell over the dining room of Castellanos on a Thursday evening in late September, and the person who caused it was a 23-year-old waitress named Lucia Ferrante, who had worked the Thursday dinner shift for 14 months, and who, by her own description and the description of everyone who worked alongside her, was the quietest person on the floor, not unfriendly, not cold, just quiet in the particular way of people who carry more inside them than they tend to show. She had grown up in a small town in the interior of Sicily until she was 11, when her family had moved to America, and she had spent the years since existing in that particular in-between space of people who belong fully to two places and therefore sometimes feel they belong completely to neither. Her Sicilian was her grandmother's Sicilian, the old dialect, the one from the villages, in the hills. Not the cleaned-up version you heard in films, or from people who had learned it academically, the kind of Sicilian that existed in the mouths of people who had never needed to perform it for anyone because it was simply the language of their kitchen and their courtyard and their earliest memories. She had not spoken it publicly in years. This is the part of the story that matters. Castellanos was not the kind of restaurant where you walked in off the street. It had white tablecloths and a wine library along the dark wood wall and chandeliers that cast everything in the particular amber warmth that makes ordinary people feel important, and important people feel comfortable. The reservation that evening for table 4 was under the name Conti. The name meant nothing to Lucia when she saw it on the seating chart. It meant something to the restaurant manager, a careful man named Gerald who had spent the afternoon making quiet adjustments to the surrounding tables and briefing the senior staff with the specific nervous energy of someone managing an outcome they very much did not want to get wrong. What Gerald told the senior staff was that Victor Conti was a man of considerable means and considerable influence, and that his father, Aldo Conti, was visiting from Sicily for the first time in 11 years, and that the elder Mr. Conti spoke very little English, and that the evening should be handled with particular care and attention. What Gerald did not tell the senior staff, because it was the kind of thing Gerald was paid not to say out loud, was that the Conti name carried a specific weight in certain circles of this city that had nothing to do with restaurant reservations. The senior staff understood anyway. There are things in a city that everyone who works in certain rooms understands without being told. Lucia had not been in the briefing. She had been restocking the service station at the back when Gerald gathered the others, and when she returned to the floor and asked quietly what she had missed, a colleague had said simply that table 4 was important, and to let the senior staff lead. Lucia had nodded and gone back to her section, which did not include table 4. Victor Conti arrived at 7:15. He was in his early 50s, dark-haired, well-dressed in the particular way of men who have worn good suits long enough that the suits have become part of how they think about themselves. He moved through the room with the ease of someone who has never in his adult life had to wonder whether there was space for him beside him, and slightly behind was his son, a man in his late 20s, also well-dressed, with tattoos visible at his collar and on both hands. The kind of tattoos that tell a story if you know how to read them, and between them, walking slowly but upright, was Aldo Conti. He was 81 years old. He wore a black suit with a white shirt and a dark tie and his sunglasses indoors, which on a younger man might have seemed affected, but on him seemed simply correct, as though his eyes had earned the right to their own arrangements. He had tattoos on his hands and neck, faded with age into the particular blue-gray of old ink, and he moved with the deliberate care of a man who is not in a hurry because he has lived long enough to understand that hurry is mostly a young person's error. The room noted them, not loudly, not obviously, but the particular quality of attention in the room shifted in the way it does when people who understand certain things recognize certain things. Gerald materialized immediately and guided them to table 4 with the practiced warmth of a man who has made his living reading rooms. A senior server materialized beside Gerald. Everything was proceeding correctly, and then Lucia came around the corner of the service station with a tray of water glasses for the table beside table 4, following her normal route, doing her normal work, and she was 3 steps from table 4 before she registered what was happening at it. She registered the Conti party, she registered Gerald's presence, which meant this was significant. She began to redirect her path, and then the old man looked up. He had taken off his sunglasses to read the menu, and his eyes, still sharp, still present, the eyes of a man whose mind had not slowed even if his body had made certain concessions to the years, moved across the room in the habitual scan of someone who has spent a lifetime reading environments. They landed on Lucia. She stopped not because of anything threatening, because he was looking at her the way very old people sometimes look at very young people when they see something in them that most people have stopped bothering to look for. He said something. He said it quietly, to no one in particular. In Sicilian, he said, "Questa piccerida mi ricorda a mia figlia quando era giovane," which means, in the dialect of the Sicilian interior hills, "This young girl reminds me of my daughter when she was young." Victor looked at his father. The younger Conti looked at his grandfather. Neither of them said anything. It was not clear whether they had understood precisely what he said, or whether the old dialect was beyond their range. Lucia had understood every word. She stood with her tray of water glasses, and she felt something move through her that was not professional training, and was not nervousness, and was not any feeling she could have named quickly. It was the feeling of hearing a language in a public place that you have only ever heard in private, the feeling of your grandmother's kitchen arriving unexpectedly in a room full of strangers. She made a decision. She set the tray down on the nearest available surface. She walked to table 4. She stood at the appropriate distance from the old man, and she said to him, in the same dialect, in the same cadence, in the same hills of Sicily Sicilian that he had used, "Benvenuto, signori siti di quali paesi," which means, "Welcome, sir. Which town are you from?" The room stopped. Not a single person at the surrounding tables was looking at their food. Victor Conti looked at his son. His son looked at Lucia. Gerald, standing 2 feet away, looked at all of them with the expression of a man experiencing several emotions simultaneously and not yet certain which one was going to win. Aldo Conti was very still for a moment. Then something happened to his face that was visible from across a room. The old man's face opened, not in surprise exactly, in something that was closer to recognition, the kind of recognition that has nothing to do with knowing a person, and everything to do with encountering something that belongs to a part of your life you thought was very far away. He said to her, in that same dialect, "Palermo? No, not Palermo. Your words are from the inside," she said. "Enna. My grandmother was from a village outside Enna." He put his hand over his chest. He said, "My mother was from outside Enna." They looked at each other, the old man and the young waitress, in the room full of crystal glasses and people in good suits, connected by a village neither of them had been born in, speaking a dialect that fewer people could speak with every passing decade. He said, and his voice carried in the quiet room, "You sound like someone I have not heard in 40 years, she said. "My grandmother spoke it to me every day until I was 11. I was afraid I had lost it." He shook his head. He said, "You have not lost it. It is in you. It does not leave." Victor Conti was watching this exchange with an expression that had moved past surprise into something quieter and more private. He said to Lucia, in English, "How long have you worked here?" she said. 14 months, he said. "And you speak Sicilian dialect?" She said, "My grandmother raised me in it until we came to America. I have not had much occasion to use it." "Here," he said. "Why not?" She thought about the honest answer. She said, "It is not always easy to know when something private belongs in a public place." Victor looked at his father. The old man was still watching Lucia. He said something to Victor in Sicilian, the standard version, not the dialect. He said, "Offer her a seat." Victor looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the situation and made the rapid calculation of a man who has built his career on reading which moments require flexibility. He said, "Please," and gestured to the chair. Lucia said, "I am working," Victor said. For 10 minutes she looked at Gerald. Gerald made a small movement with his head that meant yes. 10 minutes? Go. She sat. She sat across from the old man, and his grandson and she talked with Aldo Conti in the language of his mother and her grandmother, about the villages in the hills outside Enna, about the particular smell of that specific Sicilian interior in summer, which is nothing like the coast, and everything like dust and rosemary and stone, about food that people from that region make that nobody else makes exactly the same way, about words in the dialect that do not exist in standard Italian because the experience they describe was too specific to that place, and that people to have traveled beyond it, the younger Conti, whose name she learned was Marco, sat and watched his grandfather's face during this conversation with the full and unself-conscious attention of someone seeing something they have never seen before. At one point he leaned toward Victor and said quietly in English, "I have never seen him like this," Victor said, equally quiet. "Neither have I." After 12 minutes, Lucia stood. She said to Aldo, in the dialect, "I have to return to my work." He took her hand. He held it for a moment with the thin, papery grip of an 81-year-old man who has shaken a very large number of hands over the course of a very long life, and who knows the difference between the hands that matter and the ones that do not. He said, "You are a good girl." He paused. He said, "Your grandmother taught you well. Tell her that an old man from outside Enna says she did a fine thing." Lucia said, "She passed away 4 years ago." The old man nodded. He said, "Then she already knows." Lucia picked up her tray from where she had left it. She finished restocking the water glasses at the next table. She went back to her section. She did not cry until she was in the back corridor by the service station, where she stood for approximately 90 seconds with her hand over her mouth and her eyes closed, breathing. Then she straightened up. She went back to the floor. She did her job at the end of the evening. When the Conti party was leaving, Marco found her at the service station. He said, "My grandfather wants you to have this." He held out an envelope. She said, "I cannot accept that." He said, "It is not what you think it is." She opened it. Inside was a card. On the card, in the careful handwriting of a man for whom writing had always been a deliberate act, were 4 lines in Sicilian dialect. She read them. They were from an old Sicilian saying that her grandmother had also known, about how the language you are given as a child is the house you carry inside you wherever you go, and how a person who keeps that house in good repair is a person who has kept faith with where they came from. Below the saying, in smaller letters, the old man had written a single line in Italian that did not need translation. It said, "You have not lost anything." She folded the card. She put it in her apron pocket. Marco was watching her. He said, "I did not know he could still write like that." His hands shake. Now, she said, "He wrote it very clearly." Marco said, "He must have taken his time." There was a pause. He said, "He is going back to Sicily on Sunday. He has not wanted to talk much this trip. He misses my grandmother. She passed away last year," he said. "Tonight was the first time I have seen him be himself since the funeral." Lucia looked at the card in her pocket. She thought about her own grandmother. She thought about 11 years old and a kitchen in Sicily and a language she had carried across an ocean and kept inside her like a house she was not always sure she was allowed to live in. She said to Marco, "Tell him I will keep it." He said, "He already knows." Gerald, who had watched the entirety of the evening from various professional distances and was a man not given to sentiment by virtue of 30 years in the restaurant business, said to his assistant manager at the end of the night, "In 30 years, I have seen a lot of things in this room." His assistant manager waited. Gerald said, "That was something." He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. If this story moved, you please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and leave a comment below. Tell us about something you were given in childhood that you almost forgot you were still carrying. We read every single one.